Well, hello, my name is Cécile Shea. I am a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. Welcome to all of you who are watching live or who are watching in the future, and an especially warm and grateful welcome to the members of the Chicago Council. Your support helps to make conversations like today's possible. In a moment, I'll be introducing our two distinguished participants today. But first, let me just remind all of you that we, the Chicago Council, are a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by everyone today, including myself, are our own and are not necessarily those of the Chicago Council. When we are done with our opening discussion, which will last about 25 minutes, you will have the opportunity to ask questions via ccga.live. And you can log on now. You can ask questions and you can upvote questions that are already there. So please do send us some questions and I will be passing those on to our participants. We're very pleased to welcome two former members of the US Congress today. Both have represented the Chicagoland area. Beginning with Melissa Bean, who was the US representative for the former Illinois 8th Congressional District from 2005 to 2011. That was before redistricting in 2011. The 8th at that point, very, very roughly, took in some of the northwestern suburbs, ran from Schaumburg up to the border of Wisconsin. Congresswoman Bean described herself, I suppose, as a moderate, a blue dog Democrat. She was she was quite pro-business and represented the moderate wing of the Democratic Party for her constituents. Upon leaving Congress, Melissa became the president and CEO of the Executives Club of Chicago, the chair of Midwest operations for JP Morgan Chase, and is currently the CEO of Mesereau Wealth Advisors, part of Mesereau Financial. Bob Dold Jr. Wikipedia helpfully reminds us that this is not Bob Dole, but Bob Dold. So I don't know if you've ever seen that message on the top of your bio page, Bob. Bob Dold Jr. was the U.S. representative for Illinois' 10th Congressional District from 2011 to 2013, and then again from 2015 to 2017. And that district is the northeastern suburbs, starting just south of, I guess, Highland Park, and again running up to the border with Wisconsin. He would have defined himself, I think probably still does, as a moderate Republican, socially progressive, and fiscally conservative. He was a founder of the No Labels movement, looking to end gridlock and find new ways to work together on Capitol Hill, and also a participant in the Tuesday Lunch group of moderate Republicans. Since leaving Congress, and before entering Congress, he runs the family-owned business Rose to Pest Solutions, which operates in a number of states around the US, in particular, a number of states in the Midwest. So he has that sort of background also. So welcome to both of you. We are going to be discussing the Midwest today. That is our theme, but based on some of the worried tweets from smart people that we are seeing and comments in the news media this morning based on some developments in the last 24 hours, I wanted to ask you your thoughts on how much we should be concerned about the health of our democracy and threats to our democracy based on the unwillingness of leading Republicans to accept the election results. Some events in the Department of Justice in the last 14 hours that seem like attempts to politicize the investigatory arm that is supposed to be investigating allegations of voter fraud. And just the really exponential growth in the number of Republicans who believe that there was widespread fraud in this election, despite the fact that there have been very few verified even accusations of that fraud. So Bob, you're a Republican, so we'll start with you. I actually have a quote that is being repeated often from David Frum. This is a quote from 2018. David Frum, of course, is a leading Republican thinker and former speechwriter, I believe, for George W. Bush. He wrote in 2018, if conservatives become convinced that they cannot win democratically, they will not abandon conservatism, they will reject democracy. Should we be worried today that a lot of people are going to reject democracy?
I don't believe so. First of all, I want to thank you for giving me an opportunity to be on today and have a conversation. I honestly believe that most Republicans out there should be, again, actively engaged in the democratic process should expect that the results will be fairly counted, and that the election results are going to be good. If there are instances of fraud where things are brought out, they need to be looked into. They need to be investigated, because that undermines the very fabric of our democracy. I do not believe that the outcome of this election from the presidential side of things is going to be overturned, but that doesn't mean that if there's irregularities, they shouldn't be investigated to the full extent that we possibly can. So right now it's President-elect Biden. I believe that will be the case unless something is dramatic changes with the election counts in several of the key states. But as it looks right now, there's no question in my mind, and I believe from a good number of Republicans, that the election will stand as is. And if we really want to peel back the onion, Cécile, we can look at this election where Republicans picked up state houses, where the blue wave that was supposed to take out a number of senators and give the Senate to the Democratic Party didn't happen. We saw a repudiation here in Illinois of the progressive tax. So, I mean, again, as we look at these things, these are things that I think Republicans need to take a look at before we decide and say that this was a completely fraudulent election.
So I'm going to get to you in a second, Melissa, but Bob, are you disappointed that your former colleagues are not saying what you just said? I mean, so many of them seem to be feeding this furor over the results and the belief that there was widespread fraud.
Listen, I mean, widespread fraud, if there's any fraud, doesn't have to be widespread. If there's any fraud, we need to root that out, right? That just undermines the very fabric of our democratic elections. And so, look, I mean, we're coming from Chicago, the Chicago area, and we've got a historical kind of reference of kind of shenanigans that happen inside of Chicago politics. But if there's fraud, we need to root it out. And until that's actually been proven, we have to stand with what the election results come back at. And right now, that is saying that it's going to be President-elect Biden, and that's what we'll stand with unless it's been proven otherwise.
Melissa, are we in a crisis point? Should we be worried that our democracy is going to fail us in the next few years? Oh, unmute yourself, Melissa.
I would agree with everything Bob said. I don't believe so, but I do believe people are going to have to speak up if things get carried away. I think, sadly, unlike Bob and other moderate Republicans who've served in the past, that's a much quieter group since Trump became elected. I think they're more afraid of his Twitter power than they are of speaking up for what's right, and that's really got to change. But I'm confident enough of them will join, Mitt Romney and others who have, boldly stood for what's right. And, the foundation of our democracy is built on free and fair elections. And I think Bob stated it very well. I also think it's important to note that Hillary Clinton, who won, by almost 3 million more of the popular votes in her election, and the blue states that she lost that Biden now won back were by very minor margins, by narrower margins than Trump just lost them back to Biden. And she didn't say, of course, there's not going to be a transition of power. She stepped aside. She supported a peaceful transition. She conceded. You could even go back to Al Gore's election, where it hung in one state, and the hanging chads, which ultimately ended up going his way, but he had conceded prior because he was more focused on a peaceful transition of power than waiting for the courts to sort through everything. And he was criticized by many in his own party, but he did what he felt was right. We can only hope that prevailing leaders will follow that guidance, but they need more people to be giving them that guidance.
So let me ask you, we have a program here, the Emerging Leaders Program of young future leaders in their 30s. 2 of our alumni are now working on Capitol Hill, actually, including Raj Krishnamurthy, who I think represents your old constituency, right, Melissa? Yeah.
Yes.
So they had a conversation a week ago about what we should do to strengthen our democracy and to strengthen our institutions. And the one common element from each of the different working groups came out to be restore civics education and improve civics education in our schools, improve social studies education generally in our schools. So, and I was shocked that a lot of school districts don't teach civics anymore. I mean, that was a core part of high school when I was a kid. So what about you all? I mean, is that part of it? Have we kind of raised a couple generations who don't understand the democratic process, or what else should we be doing to strengthen democracy in our country right now? Either of you want to start, or Bob, have you thought of this? I'm sure you have.
As we look at kind of how do we strengthen our democracy, I think first of all, you have to take a step back and give a tremendous amount of credit to the electorate who came out in record numbers. Yeah. So that is a huge plus. When we have record numbers of people going to the polls to voice their opinion, which is one of the very basics. In fact, the single biggest thing we ask people to do is please make sure you get out and vote, as opposed to the apathetic view that many take, which is it doesn't matter. Right. My vote's not going to count. I'm going to get out and actually vote. And we saw that happen significantly. So look, I think civics education is important. I think service is important, regardless of where it comes, whether it be government service, whether it be service to the community. And I think the more people recognize that, and frankly, I think it's going to be incumbent upon the media, it's going to be incumbent upon others not to vilify and create this vitriol amongst the two different sides in order to get more good people to say, you know what, this is something that I want to do. And ultimately right now we have more good people that are saying, no, thank you. I'm not interested in getting engaged. But I do think it does start with trying to talk about education in the schools, about, civic education, about what our government does and how it works and how they can be engaged.
Mm-hmm. Well, Melissa, how about you? How are we going to strengthen our democratic institutions in our country?
One, I think we do need civics education to be reemphasized in schools from a very young age. I think that's lacking as compared to when we grew up. I also think that it's important that, as Bob said, every vote counts. So people do come out and show up and participate. And I'm someone who lost an election by less than 1/1000% during Tea Party swing into Congress. And so I can speak to the value of every single vote. And again, I waited till the margin of victory because I was actually ahead and I was encouraged to concede or to declare victory. I was ahead on election night and my own team said, go out and declare victory. And I said, and I knew it was going to be tight. And because I could just sort of feel it out there. And I said, well, what's the margin of victory and how many outstanding votes are there? And I was like, I'm not going to do it. And so I didn't. And then it swung the other way. Then it swung back to me. Then it swung the other way. And ultimately, by just over 200 votes out of something like 240,000 cast, I ended up losing. But I waited till there was a margin of victory by my opponent, it turned out, that exceeded the outstanding ballots. And then I conceded. And I think that's the way it needs to go. But it's also a reminder to everybody, because I had plenty of people call me after the fact and said, I thought you had it in the bag. I feel so bad I didn't vote.
Interesting. All right. Yes, that is I mean, I heard similar stories when I took civics that, you never know, your vote may really matter. So Thank you very much. So now we're going to move in a little bit, talk about the Midwest, and you can define the Midwest however you want. It's either 12 states or it doesn't exist, depending on, whose books you read. If you had Joe Biden, Kamala Harris sitting in your living room right now, and they asked you what their priorities should be, and in particular, what does the Midwest need from a new White House? Again, we're presuming that they are going to be the next president and vice president. What advice would you give them? Bob, what advice would you give the president-elect and the vice president-elect?
Wow, that's you're giving me some great authority there that I'm going to be able to give them advice. And that, well, one, I can give it, but will they take it? Ultimately, what I would tell them is that the Midwest is hardworking. We're a big manufacturing base. And ultimately, what we do in terms of trade is going to be really important. Our financial industry in terms of regulation and those types of things, we're not afraid of regulation. In fact, what we want is more consistency. So let us know what the rules of the game are going to be. Let's make sure that it's fair so that we can actually plan accordingly and get out and actually execute. I think the Midwest is, we're very more reasonable. What I would say is we're reasonable people in the Midwest, and we work hard, want to play by the rules, and we want to get ahead. I think they have an opportunity if they choose to take it. And ultimately what happens with these elections is they oftentimes overplay their mandate and believe that they've been granted a mandate to do X, Y, and Z. And the pendulum will swing. If it swings too far, we're going to see a repudiation of that. It's going to come right back. I think probably one of the best things that's happened to a potential Biden administration is the fact that the Senate is potentially not going to be a Democratic Senate, which will temper significantly the progressive wing of the party and their need to pack the courts and their need to declare statehood for DC and Puerto Rico and all of the other Green New Deal and those types of things, which I think would be an overreach, certainly. And so my advice to certainly the president-elect and the vice president-elect would be to temper what they do, but I would be focusing on manufacturing and trying to make sure that we're getting people back to work in the midst of a pandemic, which I recognize is going to be the number one thing. Ultimately, where they're going to have some difficulty is that the number one thing that united the Democratic Party and the promise that Joe Biden gave to the people was, we're going to defeat Donald Trump. And now that that's done, kind of where do they go from here? And so I think kind of governing is going to be a more difficult task for them. But I would argue that if you look back at the Obama administration, much of the must-pass legislation that had to happen really was Joe Biden going up to the United States Senate and cutting deals with longtime friends. He's an institutionalist. And so his ability to actually work across the aisle and cut deals absolutely is there. Take Mitch McConnell. Joe Biden got to the Senate in 1972, Mitch McConnell in 84, and they've worked decades together. And so this is an opportunity that President-elect Biden has.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I want to come back because I think you were alluding to tariffs in part of your answer. So maybe we can come back to that, but I want to give Melissa a chance to say what advice she would give to Vice President-elect Harris and President-elect Biden if you had the chance.
No, I think I'm almost parroting Bob's remarks, but the Midwest is the hub of manufacturing in this country, and small businesses, can and should be thriving. And if they're not, if the Midwest isn't succeeding, the country's got a problem, and any president should be paying close attention to what's happening in the Midwest. Chicago is uniquely positioned because we touch every industry. We're big in travel and entertainment, with Midwest and O'Hare being one of the largest airports in the country globally, and access to the world. Every part of every industry is represented here, and so you can get a good sampling on how we're doing. And there are a number of businesses that are hurting. Some of them specifically COVID related, obviously, in entertainment and travel, but even beyond that. And I think that has to be the focus. I think the good news is, Obama, Biden together understood the importance of the small business community. And I don't think that's going to be something that's lost on Joe Biden. They supported $18 billion of SBA funding back during their administration to really make sure access to capital would be available to small businesses. So I think that will be consistent. If you look at Joe Biden's plans, they're very much about innovation and growth, and that's important. I think one of the mistakes, frankly, in the campaign that Biden said when he was asked about energy and oil and gas and are you against it, he should have just turned that right around and said, it's not an oil and gas industry anymore. It's an energy industry. And companies that were traditionally oil and gas have evolved themselves because that's where the industry is moving to. And so we just need policies that will support, not just in that industry, but in every industry, innovation is happening, and to support that with proper tax credits to be moving to where the new jobs of America are going to be. And the other thing I would say is education is going to be so critical, because there will continue with disruption to be displacement in many industries. That's a given. That's already proven. But within the same companies, you look at an Amazon, which is a fast growing company, they're going to use more and more robots in warehouses to be doing picking and packing. And that's going to eliminate some jobs on the warehouse floor. But there's even more new jobs within Amazon for programmers and technology people and logistics folks. And so we have to recognize as a country that education isn't just for the young, but for adults to keep pace with an evolving employment environment so that they can keep their skills current and be employable.
Yeah, I have a friend who is a VC guy out in Silicon Valley, and the point that he makes is when today's 20-year-olds are 50, the economy will be completely different. And 50-year-olds are the people who are always hurt in any recession, right? There, to this day, people who were 50 in 2008, a huge percentage of them have not gone back to work. And so we should be preparing today's young people, is his point, to be flexible and broadly enough educated that they'll be able to deal with the seismic changes that occur in the labor force over the next 20 to 30 years. And I fear sometimes we're not doing that. So thank you for that answer. It was really...
One last thing I'd say is education is ongoing, and community colleges are going to be an important part of helping people evolve. And Jill Biden has, with an education background, has very much sort of led and been involved in that effort. And I think it will always be present in President-elect Biden's mind as he moves forward.
So, for both of you, I mentioned before that some people would say the Midwest doesn't even exist. And of course, that book, 9 Nations of North America, came out in 1981 and is still discussed broadly. Argued there was no Midwest. The area that is defined as the Midwest is, partially in the breadbasket, partially in what he called what did he call it? The furnace, the industrial area that basically stretched from Chicago all the way to New York. And part of it's in Dixie, what he defined as Dixie. So what about unifying the country? What about unifying the Midwest? Is there a way that the next president can bring us all together? Is there a way the next Senate and the next House can pull the country together a little bit and help us understand each other a little more? Because a lot of people will say that we are moving further apart and know each other less and less as time goes on, rather than knowing each other a little bit better. Bob, is this hopeless? I mean, is there something that we can do to bridge the so-called urban-rural divide in this country?
Okay, I think that as you look at the country, we can boil it down to look at Illinois, right? So we look at Illinois and we've got totally different views and different, you take Chicago and then you take downstate, or you take Chicago and you go out west. Look, I think differences are what make our country better, stronger. Yeah. And so look, it's not about kind of a unity of thought, or a unity that makes us all the same. The strength of our nation is that we welcome all comers. And that's certainly something that I think that as we talk about immigration and those types of issues, that we're looking for the best and the brightest to come. As we look at the Midwest is different than the South. It's different than the Northeast. It's different than the West. But those aren't bad things. Those are good things. And ultimately, as we look at kind of how do we communicate and what are we doing to kind of put a stamp of identity, first and foremost, we're all Americans. And that's, I think, absolutely critical in terms of a unifying message. Doesn't mean I have to believe what my neighbor believes, or that we can have different, viewpoints on different policy. But ultimately, there should be some unifying things that guide us as a nation. One of those things, again, is we talk about our democracy, free and fair elections and all those types of things. But when the election's done, it's time for us to come together and march forward, because there's no question there may be differences in the policy, but my hope is that we as a nation still are looking to try to do the same things. We want to try to grow our economy. We want to make sure that we're stronger and healthier. We want to make sure that we're able to get more people into good, high-paying jobs. Those are all good things. But as you look at the demographic, is there such thing as the Midwest? I would argue absolutely there is, and we should be proud about what makes us a little bit different. But also, we have a huge melting pot in the Midwest that I think is, makes us stronger.
Thank you. Melissa, how about you? Is there such a thing as a Midwest? And perhaps more importantly, how can we bridge this so-called rural-urban divide that we see electorally and other ways in this country?
No, I would agree. I think the Midwest is this hardworking, known as a manufacturing hub place, and we're very proud of that, and we should be. And whether you go down the whole Rust Belt, not just in Illinois, but Ohio and Michigan and all of these states together have produced some of the iconic brands and products that are known around the world and that the U.S. is known for. So yes, there's a U.S. and I think we could take a Midwest, and we should take some pride in that. I think what's unique also about the Midwest is we do have both the urban and the rural communities. And so we have an understanding of both, and we need to have an understanding of both. Supply chains are changing, certainly for farmers. There's been trade issues that have affected them. I think we need to always be paying attention to those who are producing the food that nourishes our communities. I do believe you're going to see, Joe Biden be a strong advocate and communicator to all of those communities. I don't think it's politics when he says, it's my job to work for every one of you, those who worked for, who voted for me, those who didn't, and to be listening and available. But that's kind of who he's been for 47 years. I think, campaigns try to paint people in different ways, and they try to suddenly paint him as some far left guy. But for 47 years, he's never been that. He's always been one who's worked across the aisle. I think he'll continue to do that. I think one of his challenges, frankly, will be, eyes should be on Mitch McConnell, because he's a guy who used to work across the aisle, and then that very much changed. And partly, Harry Reid was a very partisan guy too. And then I think the two of them became so entrenched in partisanship, and we haven't seen Mitch McConnell ease up on that. And he has an opportunity to really lead the Republicans to be part of the solution, part of a legislative body that comes up with ideas, not just a party of no. But that's a big question in whether he will do that. Instead of let's just keep voting to get rid of healthcare, come up with an alternative or amend what's there and support the principles that were in the Affordable Care Act that are important to protect. I think that was one of the missed opportunities in the Biden campaign. They finally mentioned, and that was only because of the Supreme Court nomination process going on, pre-existing conditions. And I think one of the things that was often talked about in relation to the ACA or Obamacare, whatever you want to call it, was the 20 million people that could lose care. And of course, that's a really important issue. But what was missed in talking about healthcare was what it did for people who already had insurance. People forget, and Democrats, they were pretty good on policymaking. Not that that was a perfect bill. There's definitely room for improvement, but the core things were really strong and important for this nation, and they didn't communicate them well. It was like an untold story. So for instance, on healthcare, the number one cause of bankruptcy in the country prior to the ACA was having one catastrophic illness in a family. And I'm not talking about for people who didn't have healthcare, but people who had healthcare, worked at an employer, said, I have a really good plan, but you don't really know what's in your plan until you're in the situation. And then what they didn't realize is there were caps. So the cap could be $1 million. It could be $2 million. But we all know with a catastrophic illness, it could be $4 or $5 million. Boom, they go to bankruptcy. We were the only industrialized nation where people who'd worked their whole lives were losing everything because of one illness. And that's something that's up for grabs if the ACA gets overturned and if there isn't some other alternative to go along with that, along with pre-existing conditions, along with 26-year-olds, being able to be on their parents' plan. There's a lot of pieces of this that people are going to want to protect they don't know about. But I digress a bit, but it was an example of how policy does matter, and we all got to start paying attention to the actual content and not just oppose it because of who wrote it.
Yeah. Which I think leads to some of the questions that we're going to get to in a moment, which are people who appreciate both of your words about cooperating across the aisle and being nice to people, but they seem to be a little dubious about whether the folks in Washington have any intention at all of doing any of that. But before we get to that question, I want to ask another specific one about two things that are impacting the Midwest in particular right now. We have questions on some of these. One is tariffs. What would you like to see a Biden administration do about tariffs? And what can we do in the future to go back to what the Constitution mandates and have Congress controlling tariffs and not leaving it up to the whim of a president? Or do we need to even do that? And the second issue that I think is broadly impacting the Midwest right now, in addition to tariffs, just left my brain. Sorry, we'll come back to that. So let's start. Give me 1 second. We'll come back to tariffs. We'll come back to the second item that people have written in about. But let's start with tariffs. What do you think the Biden administration needs to do about tariffs? Bob, how about you? I think you were alluding to tariffs in part when you were talking about strengthening our industrial and our agriculture sector.
Well, I think as we look at trade's going to be very important, specifically for the Midwest. We're a huge manufacturing area. We obviously have a lot of agriculture as well. And when we look at kind of how things are going, traditionally, we've been very pro-free trade. And I think what you've seen from this administration is turn the corner to somewhat to say, look, we know that there's dumping that's going on with aluminum, with steel, with these others that are impacting American jobs. And really kind of the focus has been, let's go to fair trade. Let's put at least more of a light on, is it fair? Are we having some sort of parity here? And if it's ultimately true free trade, hallelujah. I just don't think that that's necessarily what's been going on. And so as we look at China and we look at some of the other areas that are out there from, abroad, I think it's going to be an issue that's going to impact the Midwest significantly. In terms of should the president have the authority, the president needs to have the flexibility to be able to do some negotiating, no question about it. But ultimately, it does boil down, the Congress needs to be that check, as it were, on making sure that if there is a tariff, it's got to be running through Congress. I sat on the Ways and Means Committee. We obviously did a lot of work with regard to what was going on from a trade perspective, and sitting down and hearing about the negotiations and pushing back on areas where we thought that they weren't being strong enough, or areas where we wanted to see some changes. So I think that's the way it should be. And I want to make sure that we're giving some flexibility to our trade representatives' negotiations that the president may have when they're out there doing some bilateral meetings and negotiations, especially as foreign travel is going on. It's really important for sectors, especially in the Midwest, that we're able to make our products and be able to get them out all over the globe, that we're able to help feed the world. Those are things that we should be proud of, and we want to make sure that we've got easy access to those markets.
Great, thank you. Do you have anything to add, Melissa? Any thoughts on tariffs?
No, I think it's true. I also am a person who is pro-trade, but pro-trade that is, an informed pro-trade perspective. And that means pro-trade in an environment where the pie is growing. And if you look at what's going around the globe, it's not unique to the US that people are afraid of trade agreements. They always feel they're going to get the raw deal. And that's true around the world. And so it's important that leaders around the world, when they approach these, find and educate their people about, yes, we might lose a little bit over here, but we're going to gain over here, and we're going to work that out with policies that help those that might suffer, some of the imbalances that can occur. But if overall it's a win, and it should be in a growing global economy, that's a positive thing. That's a job creator. So there's a lot more education that has to go into it. I think rhetoric really matters when it comes to trade. But I think there's no question, and I would say that the president was right, as previous presidents were, on addressing some of the dumping, some of the reverse engineering and copying, so not respecting intellectual property protections. So IP protections are particularly critical. What we're seeing now, though, in other countries like China, is they are now creating their own IP. They built an industry by reverse engineering and copying it. And now they've become innovators and they have protections that they need. And so they're more open to the working with us on those types of things to be negotiated. But if our rhetoric is highly protectionist, I don't think that helps us move forward. I think the Biden administration will address some of these issues, but I think they're going to go slow on tariffs. I think there is relationships that have been damaged around the world that need to be repaired. And I think that's going to be one of the first things that Joe Biden will do. He's well respected around the world, and I think he's going to reestablish more positive and productive communication with our global partners, which will create an environment to better address the trade scenarios.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to be watching this closely too. And I agree completely that one of the problems people like me, one of the mistakes people like me have made over the years is only talking about trade from 30,000 feet. You know, trade adds 3% to GDP, and never acknowledging that that's a mean. So someone has helped 6% and someone has hurt 3%. Right. And it's the people who are hurt who then get angry and feel like the elites aren't listening to them and don't care. And the same is true on immigration policy. I think we need to be a lot more careful in how we throw numbers around and acknowledging that, you know, we need to help the people who are going to be potentially harmed with some of these decisions. So thank you for that. I remember what the other question was. There was a very specific and good question about what can we expect from the new administration for possible help to Illinois. And I'm going to say both broad help for our financial situation or others, but also specifically, you know, the SALT tax change has been really damaging to particularly people who live in the northern suburbs, right? Or to many of them. And SALT meaning state and local taxes. Some of the mortgage rate deduction changes have also hurt people. And you're starting to see now house values decline as was predicted. So what things maybe should the state government be asking for in terms of help from the federal government? And also, are there decisions that were made in the last 4 years that have particularly hurt some of the metro areas that you would like to see the Biden administration roll back, like the SALT tax deduction?
Well, I think the Biden administration has talked about a different tax approach. And I don't think it'll be the first thing he would do, but I think he will try to address the tax cuts that the Trump administration implemented, which were widely hailed as stimulative and help the economy. But if you actually look, Alan Blinder, a former an economist, well-known economist and former deputy chair at the Fed Reserve, he wrote an article recently about the myth of the Trump, economic expansion, and it really showed how unemployment over an 11-year period has continued to go down and continued to under Trump as well, and how GDP has continued to go up for the same period, and it didn't measurably move under the Trump administration, even after the $2 trillion tax cut that mostly went to corporations and billionaires. Not to say that corporate taxes didn't need to be addressed to create a globally competitive rate, but even corporations themselves and CEOs of plenty of companies were expecting considerably less than what they got. And when you reduce corporate taxes to such a great extent, where are those taxes going to go? They're going to go on regular working class people. And so, there needs to be a balance between corporate and individual taxes, and your average taxpayer did not benefit from those tax cuts. So I think Biden's plan is to adjust that somewhat and to take some of what comes back in revenues by eliminating or reducing the billionaire tax cut to put that into infrastructure. And that's going to be what I think, not just the Midwest, I think states and municipalities around the world want to see infrastructure spending. It will create a lot of jobs in not only energy, but in roads and bridges that are failing. So that's been something I think there'll be bipartisan support for, But I think after the tax cuts, there was no appetite for further spending. The dollars weren't there to do it. And I think it was a mistake on the Trump administration's part, because they kind of handicapped themselves in not being ready to then follow through on something that they had talked about doing, which I think will be a welcome step forward in building the economy.
Do you think that there would be stomach there? And I'm going to ask you the same question, Bob, in a minute. And in a quick answer, do you think there will be stomach in a Biden administration for a bailout of Chicago or some of the other Midwestern cities that might need one?
Well, that's going to come down to the stimulus. And one of the things that, Pelosi was holding out for in sort of the negotiations with Mnuchin, although it was unclear who Mnuchin was really speaking for, because McConnell's still going to do what McConnell's going to do, but was more state and local support, because there's no question that COVID has cost states so much in supporting their hospitals and all the other things that, the loss of revenues that they've faced from hotels, from entertainment, from small businesses. They're really hurting. And that's going to be a big drag on the economy. And it's something that I'm hopeful there'll be bipartisan support for, particularly as COVID has now sadly stretched beyond the blue cities, but rural America is now faced with a lot of COVID healthcare challenges and new cases. And so all states are going to need a little bit of a bailout on that. So I think that can be done in a stimulus package. Whether the president will have the appetite to do that now in a lame duck session, or he'll kick that to President-elect to deal with in January, I think that will be a critical focus and should be a critical focus of what comes out of the next stimulus bill.
Bob, how about you? Should Chicago expect a bailout from a Biden administration, or, any other city in the Midwest that might be having trouble right now?
I think what we're going to find very quickly is that as they were in the midst of talks with regard to a second or third round of stimulus with regard to the pandemic, I think you will see another stimulus package come out. The question is, how big is that going to be? There was differences of opinion about where the money should be focused. And ultimately, I do think that there will be a stimulus. How much of it goes to a bailout of the states, I don't know, but I'm sure there will be some. Certainly, if there is a stimulus package in a lame duck session that does not address that, my guess is that you would see a Biden administration try to have another round of stimulus that goes to help prop up some of the states. But ultimately, as we talk about the tax cuts, and I do want to make sure that I have a chance to respond a little bit.
Absolutely.
I do think that the tax cuts, were helpful, not just for corporations and billionaires. There's just not enough billionaires out there in terms of people getting help and support. And honestly, as we look at corporations and we look at the markets and all those other things that have really gone up significantly, I do think that there has been a positive with regard to unemployment and the like. And ultimately, that's what we're looking for, is we're looking for more people to be in good, high-paying jobs to be able to support their families and the like. As we look at kind of what's happening with the SALT, look, SALT hurts Illinois, and it hurts those high-tax states. Really, and what we're doing is we're subsidizing big government. State government is what's actually happening. And so as we look at that, be angry with your tax bill at your state government, not at the federal government. And that, again, this was a mechanism to kind of shift the burden from one to the other, right? So Illinois, if we get to deduct more from our state taxes and pay less into the federal government, that means other states that have less of the state burden are actually spending more from a federal perspective. So look, I mean, it hurts Illinois. I certainly would like to see it from a selfish standpoint go away, but understand the reason why it's there. The reason why the SALT went into effect was largely because they were trying to say, look, this is what we're going to say across the country. You have a $10,000 limit on state and local taxes. Unfortunately for Illinois, and more specifically for the northern suburbs and around the Chicagoland area, it is a significant sting. And that's something that, frankly, we just have to realize. So I know that the Biden administration wants to get rid of the SALT, deductions or get rid of the SALT tax. And that's something that I think we can look forward to. What will be the negotiations in the Congress, I don't know. But ultimately, that's one thing that he campaigned on and certainly would be helpful for taxpayers here in Illinois.
Well, thanks to both of you. We have 1 minute left, so I'm going to go 2 minutes over and just say there are a lot of questions in here which come down to, we wish there were more people like you in Washington, but you're not there. And so, can you how can you be optimistic that people will learn how to get along and sing Kumbaya in Washington, given the level of partisanship and vitriol that we have seen there right now? So I guess my parting question is, do you think we can move beyond this? Can we move forward in some kind of amity and moderation, or are we just going to see more of what we've seen the last 4, 8, 12 years? If you could give us that as your parting shot, that would be great. So Bob, we opened with you, so we'll let you go first here. All
right, well, the answer is we have to. I mean, ultimately, there's no other way forward besides having some more opportunities to work together. And ultimately, if we can focus on areas, not just of agreement, but areas that we know that we need to move forward, we know we're going to need the other side. And that's where divided government, and why I have faith, I think that Georgia is actually going to go Republican and give the Senate to the Republican Party, because again, divided government provides a little bit more certainty at times. But if we're going to move forward as a nation, we need to be able to come together. And one of the big things with regard to this, I actually look to the Fourth Estate. I look to the media, which frankly is far more editorialized today than it's ever been. And it's pick your flavor of news as opposed to reporting on the news. And ultimately, we find people that are performing in Washington as opposed to actually rolling up their sleeves and trying to work together to solve problems. And my hope is that with an institutionalist in the White House today, working with Mitch McConnell, who also is an institutionalist, we may be able to get some more things done and actually show the country that actually Republicans and Democrats can work together. Okay, thank you. So you're an optimist. I am an optimist. Melissa, how about you?
I'm an optimist too, although my pragmatic side says there's a couple of things that have to happen. Bob was known as a centrist who worked across the aisle. I was known for the same. I was not just a blue dog you mentioned earlier, but a new Dem. And the NDC has been a pro-growth, moderate Democratic coalition, which has grown to about 100 members within the Democratic Party. There used to be a Tuesday Club, and I know there then came the No Labels group that Bob helped lead on the Republican side, but that's not as big of a group. And you don't see as bold and as significant influence coming from a center within the Republican Party these days. So I think within both parties, voters make the difference. Who you elect matters. And one thing I just want to point out, and this came from a Republican strategist, David Brooks, about this idea that both parties have gone way to the extreme. Well, he actually said that the Democrats have not. They've come back towards the center. Doesn't mean you don't have the AOCs and the squad who are a minority within the Democratic caucus within the House, but there's a much bigger, center-left group in both the Blue Dogs and the New Dems. And if you look at the midterms, the folks that won in the midterms prior to this election on the Democratic side, there were like 54 new members, and something like 45 of them were the centrists who beat the lefty candidate to then go on and beat the Republican and be part of the Democratic Party. That brought them closer. And we need more of that also on the other side as well. So we're electing more Bob Dolds and less extremists. And both sides have to do that. It doesn't mean you don't need those that are further to the left and further to the right on both sides, that are there to remind the parties of some central principles that are important, and that there's not really good ideas on both sides of the aisle. But when we have people close enough to the center to reach across the aisle, that's where common sense solutions can be found, where common ground can be found, and where legislation will move forward. And so again, I just have to raise and challenge the presumption that everyone's saying it'll be so much better. I believe in divided government. But divided government with someone other than Mitch McConnell as the leader of the Senate would give me a greater degree of comfort. He has not yet signaled in the way the president-elect has that he wants to work across the aisle. He famously said, what his whole goal was to make sure Obama was a one-term president. And, failing that, just continued to obstruct for a long, long time. He's proven in his past he's capable of it. Whether he will, I think, is yet to be seen. So I don't think it would be a terrible thing if Democrats were to prevail in the Georgia Senate races. And I think that's counter to a lot of the rhetoric that's out there. But if you look at the makeup of the Democratic senators, even if he has the Senate, it doesn't mean he has a rubber stamp. They will still be there to check him.
So, okay. So thank you for that. So I would say qualified optimism from Melissa. And yeah, I was a staffer about 20 years ago, and Mitch McConnell worked across the aisle. So we'll see what happens in the next few years. Right. Same way, thank you to both of you. We went over time. Sorry to our viewers, but this was an important conversation. So best of luck to all of you, and we'll get through the next month. Don't lose heart, anyone. Thanks.
Voting.
Thanks so much.